So here I am on the CLI. I'm connecting through a console. It's a 2504, but it could be pretty much any other type of controller. I just booted this controller factory default, so I boot it for the first time. And the first thing you see is that at the side here, it says configuring management interface, starting internal DHCP server, DHCP pool, blah, blah, blah. So what this section tells you is that my 2504 is already getting ready for me to connect to one of the ports, the 4 ports, or an access point connecting to that port, and connect to do the setup through the simplified WC Express setup. But I'm on the console here, so I'm not using that interface. I'm using the CLI interface because I have a console port. So let's see what happens when you boot for the first time. First of all, the controller is going to stay there for as long as it needs until you start interacting with it. And if you are on the CLI, one thing you want to say is, do you want to terminate the auto install? And probably you want to answer yes. And that is a way for you to tell the controller that you are here on the CLI ready to interact with the system. So let me press enter and show you what the CLI looks like. So you see, once the system knows that I'm interacting with it, I need to go through that initial wizard, which is basically a set of questions, and answer those questions to configure my controller, such as name of the controller, admin username, admin password, configuration of the admin password twice to make sure I don't make any mistake. Do you want to enable link aggregation? Remember lag? You probably know what that is, but if you don't, because it's the first time you do it, you may be wondering what is the right answer. Should you say yes or should you say no? The answer in capital is the default answer. So if I just pressed enter like I did here, I'm saying no, I don't want to enable lag, which means that I'm not grouping my 4 ports together in one single virtual port. I could say yes, depending on how your network is being set. Then I'm going to configure the management interface IP address, and of course the corresponding net mask for that interface, the gateway to which the controller is going to be connecting to through that interface. If you configure an IP address, you also want to tell the system in which VLAN you are. Notice the thing here that says cleaning up provisioning SSID. That means that at this point, because I'm filling up the interface here through the CLI, my controller understands that I'm not going to use the WLC Express setup through the ports. So it's clearing up the SSID, it's going to clear up the DHCP scope it has ready on those ports because it knows nobody's going to use them. Another thing I would like to attract your attention to is to the interface VLAN tag. You see 0 means untagged. So on the controller there is no default VLAN 1. There is no default. 0 is no tag. 1 is VLAN 1 tag. There is no VLAN 1 being the default. Alright, so that's one thing. Then as you continue, all that setting about the DHCP pool, all the SSID that were already on the interfaces are going to be removed and they won't be available anymore. Next, what is your management interface port? You have 4 ports. Is it port 1, 2, 3, or 4? If you use lag, it's any of those, right? Here I'm not, so I'm going to set port number 1. And then what is the DHCP server IP address for devices connecting through that management interface? Let me put one. What is the virtual gateway IP address? The virtual gateway IP address is something that you use every time you have a cluster of controllers. It's a common IP address that we send to the client to make them think that instead of having different controllers, there is one big controller that takes care of everything. We use this to pretend to be the DHCP server IP address and a few other things. Typically, this address has to be one unused address in your network. The recommended address used to be 1.1.1.1, and you still find documentation talking about this address. However, 1.1.1.1 was an unused address in the days those documentation papers were written. But today, 1.1.1.1 is assigned to somebody. So you should not use an IP address that belongs to someone because it's assigned, it doesn't belong to you. So you can use one address that we use here, which is 192.0.2.1. And that's an address you can use always because in the scope of all the addresses, this is one address which is reserved for documentation. So we know that no network will have that IP address. And that IP address has to just be an unused IP address, so there is no duplicate risk between this IP address and something in your wireless network. Okay, so let's use that one. Then it asks other questions like multicast IP address, and if you don't know what that is, it may be complicated to answer that question. Let's put one IP address here. Then it asks you something you know now. What is the mobility group? And the RF group is going to be the same at first, but you can distinguish one from the other later on. Then you have to create one SSID at least, and then you can decide if you want to use DHCP bridging mode. What is that? Well, what this is that, do you want your controller to be a relay between the wireless client and the DHCP server, or do you just want to bridge DHCP traffic to the VLAN without relaying it? Most of the time, you want to use DHCP relay, so you don't want the controller to be just a bridge. So that's why the default answer is no. Do you want to allow clients to have static IP addresses? Yes, why not, most of the time. Do you want to configure a radio server? We'll do that, but later on, so let's keep it for now. What country is your controller on? And we need to say that because that's going to impact the channels and the powers allowed on the access points connecting to this controller. However, the access points you will get will be set to a country already. So what you need really is that the controller needs to be set to the same country as the access points. Otherwise, it will be a conflict and the APs will not be able to join because they will not be able to get their parameter right with the controller. So here, my example, I'm in the US, so I'm saying US. Then you want to enable B, A, G networks? Yes. Do you want to enable auto RF? Yes, that's RM. That's why you bought a controller for RM. Do you want to configure an NTP server? Well, if you have one, you should. If you don't have one, it's okay to say no, but then you should set the clock right, because one issue that can happen is when you have a mismatch between your controller time and the access point times. We'll check that at the end of this module. So let me put some dates and some time, because I'm not using an NTP server, but at least I want my controller to be more or less in sync with what the current conditions of my network are. Then, do you want to configure IPv6 on this controller? So we said that we're not going to spend too much time on IPv6 because we did it in the autonomous world. But be aware that the controllers also support IPv6, and you can have IPv6 for the controller themselves, their IP addresses everywhere. You can use CAPWAP with IPv6. The access points can have IPv6. Everything can be IPv6 aware on the controller as well. But let's keep it for now. Once you've said everything is set, you can type yes and save. Just a trick, if you read again your setup and you realize you make a mistake, you can always type dash like I do here. And if you press enter, you're going to go back one question. So you can do minus, 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 dash, 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 as many times as you want to go back and then correct your answer for that question and then continue refilling the wizard until you go back to the end. Then say yes to save. It's going to clear up the provisioning SSID. It's going to reboot. And by rebooting, it's going to apply the setup you have here in the CLI. So that was the CLI setup. As you can tell, it's not very difficult. And if you use a larger controller like the 5508, you could connect to the service interface and have the graphical version of the same setup with the same questions over a nice screen instead of being a CLI in black and white.